Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if there are more people upstairs that are heading towards the seats, but I've been instructed to start. So let's follow some instructions. My name is Amyn Musa, and I head the projects and infrastructure practice at ALN Kenya. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, firstly, to our offices, and secondly, to this specific panel discussion, which is about financing and strengthening renewable energy projects in East Africa. I think this region finds itself at an intersection of two critical forces shaping the future of Africa's development. Economic inflation on one hand, and the green transition. In our view, the impact of the dynamics of these two forces on infrastructure development and the construction industry will be significant. East Africa's commitment to renewable energy has the potential to transform the region's energy landscape, creating more sustainable, resilient, and economically inclusive systems. As global momentum towards clean energy intensifies, the financing need for projects in solar, wind, hydro, geothermal energy across East Africa are growing. However, renewable energy initiatives are facing challenges and hurdles. High development and capital costs, regulatory hurdles, grid instability, market instability, as a result of these projects. Today, I have a very distinguished panel to discuss this ever-evolving landscape of renewable energy financing, to discuss the role of the public sector and also the private sector in this space, and the steps we think are needed to ensure the transition of the green economy in East Africa is both robust and sustainable. So thank you, all of you, for joining us. And without further ado, I will now introduce my panel and commence with the Q&A session. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Charnelle FORTUIN. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. She is the business and project developer for Hydrogène France. I will also like to introduce Ifeanyi Odo. Did I get that right? Very good. He is the East Africa director for Schneider Electrics. And a lot easier, Dennis KEYA, the regional manager for EDF East Africa. So Dennis, let us start off with you. EDF has recently set up shop in this part of the world. I am assuming when that decision was made, there was a view that there are opportunities for EDF and therefore for a whole range of developers in the renewable energy sector space. What are those opportunities that you specifically see in this region?
Thank you. Just a quick introduction. So at EDF, we are integrated across the entire energy value chain, from generation, transmission, distribution to services. When we set up shop here, we looked You actually entered the market through investments at the solar home system space. So we invested in small pay-as-you-go solar systems, B-Box and Culture. Then we also invested in commercial and industrial solar PV, so rooftop solar installations for commercial and industrial industries. So in terms of opportunities, the place we are now seeing in particular is opportunities for industries. If you look at even the Kenya Power Grid, the biggest revenue earners for Kenya Power, actually more than 50% comes from the commercial and industrial sector. So in that case, giving solar directly to the commercial and industrial sector was actually a key strategy for us. So to date, we have 7 megawatts of power that across various portfolios in industries. We have agreements to provide energy as a service. That will scale up, especially with lower battery technologies and more efficiency, so that they can eventually get rid of generators and start cleaning up their generation processes. What is also more interestingly is that the regulation has been changing. We now have wheeling in the regulation. We have net metering. Now, what will happen is that if you don't have space for 10 megawatts of your demand, or 40 megawatts, we can generate it somewhere else and use the grid network to supply you. So that regulatory framework has created opportunities across renewables from, say, solar. Again, for certain industries, we're already looking at opportunities for biomass to provide both heat and power. So that would continue transforming as technology improves, efficiency improves, but also the market has a lot of financial players that we see we can collaborate with from the debt side and also from equity partners.
Ifeanyi, I guess we're seeing what EDF is looking at it from a private perspective in terms of the opportunities. But in terms of PPPs, public-private partnerships, because a lot of what Dennis initially described is a pure B2B, private-to-private sector. What is the role, you think, of enhancing public-private partnerships in advancing renewable energy projects across the region?
Thank you. Very interesting question. I think we need to take a step back and look at the fundamental understanding when it comes to renewable use case, country, and the various dynamics. There is a strong role for, just like you mentioned, public-private partnership. But then we also need to allow room for innovation in the process. And I want to give a very specific example, maybe two, one from West and later for East, and maybe what could be the long-term perspective, thinking about East Africa specifically. And some of you might have heard this, but years ago, this was about 10 years ago, when this whole renewable energy was still, quite frankly, in the mouths of so many global leaders, just talking about it as something that is nice to do without being very practical as how to get it to where it's needed the most. Then, for me, coming back from France back to Nigeria, as of that time, was looking at, okay, what can we do? I know about this. I've been playing with this product for years. In R&D, developing, playing with it, whether it's EV charging, renewable microgrids for different applications. But going back home, then I could see very little adoption. What was the reason? It wasn't for lack of technology, because it worked. So then we started asking different questions. What can we do to make this work? Went to government. They were very oblivious. Spoke to financing company. Nobody wanted to give anybody money. So brought together, but there were lots of people really eager to make a difference. Some of these guys were straight out of school, startup companies, zero track record. Hence the reason why banks didn't want to give them money in the first place. So for me as Schneider, bringing these stakeholders together, we're able to just redesign the business model altogether to address every need that people would think about. And we started in the place where most people would not even dare to venture into. Dennis mentioned what he's trying to do with the big utilities. which is very common because these are the usual people that everybody knows what the business case might look like. But for us, we went straight into the off-grid community. Completely rural. These places, they had agro-processing. Some of them don't even have banking, so you can't even gauge their credit record. And with those guys, we sat down, came up with a direct agreement, a consensus to decide, okay, we are going to build an infrastructure for you. We'll meter it and you pay per use. And it worked. It worked so well because we were really powering the fundamentals of livelihood for them. Before we came there, they were dependent on all the various fossil fuel that you could think about, whether it's with diesel gensets or sometimes firewood to be able to do basic agro-processing equipment. With this, they were able to enjoy overnight 24 hours electricity. And here is where it gets very interesting. I want to put into numbers. How much did we have to charge them? Because remember, there wasn't any grant fund in this conversation. It was just all about how can we design a model, self-financed, that these guys could pay for. So to make it cost-effective, in dollar per kilowatt terms, and by benchmarking it to the city, it was 5 times more expensive. However, the important thing is not about how much dollar per kilowatt hour, it's about affordability with respect to the off-taker. And here is where technology made all the difference, because for us as tech providers, we had to think through everything. We applied the best of our knowledge when it comes to energy management, energy efficiency, and looked at the complete value chain. And at the end, the absolute costs that each household was paying was 2 times cheaper than the city. Essentially, it worked so well, they were enjoying 24 hours electricity, whereas those in the city were having regular outage. Now, here is where it gets even much more interesting. All the stakeholders that were very shy became bold. The banks came, the government came. In the same room we sat, I remember it was a week sponsored in a hotel in Lagos, to redesign, train everybody on what we could do differently, and drafted what then became the new mini-grid code that is used across Africa. So this was basically the birth of mini-grid. And with this, World Bank is putting over $1 billion just for that demographic. A few months ago, IFC and another World Bank is trying to then roll it out to 300 million people across Africa, because we have, across the continent, a demography of over 600 million people without electricity. Now, this is where being innovative, being clear as to the realities, country to country, region to region, and sometimes literally showing the stakeholders what could be done could make all the difference when it comes to public-private partnership. And there is a lot more at stake. Across East Africa today, the government is launching out very bold ambition, quite frankly, across the continent, bold ambitions to be net zero. East Africa, operationally, from the grid side, you can see that the renewable is very high in penetration, but the grid distribution is still weak. So here, I think where we have the gap is not just about financing renewable, it's also about looking at the infrastructure to evacuate it. And here is where the likes of Schneider Electric, EDF, is also trying to make a difference, because what we are trying to do, and you hear a lot more from Charnelle in a bit, even around hydrogen, all of these are different technologies that can bring value on the network. But now we need to see how to strengthen the grid, rethink how we finance it so that all the ecosystem, private players can inject seamlessly, and there are different models that we can think about.
And I guess with what you're saying effectively, I mean, if I think about what I've been doing in the space for 20 years, which is most of the IPP projects in the region, but these were traditional IPP projects, Dennis. You know, you go and negotiate a power purchase agreement with Kenya Power, you get your letter of support, and through that structure, we did projects like Lake Turkana, Kipeto, Malindi Solar, etc. But I guess what we're hearing from Ifeanyi is that whilst there is still a role for the traditional IPP project, all of us need to think out of the box for projects that what you described is not a traditional PPP project. The traditional IPP project was a traditional PPP project. And is that something that is also part of what you're looking into the, I would say, non-traditional IPP, non-traditional PPP space?
I'll say yes, because if you look at the grid infrastructure, yes, it's not enough to take all the power that we want to generate, yet there's still unelectrified places. So he has talked about mini grids as one way. I talked about commercial and industrial utilization of power. Now, where we go directly negotiate with customers. We have talked about wheeling. So ideally, yes, and then feeding into not just generation, but storage. Because what has happened is that we have a huge potential for wind and solar. We have a huge potential for other renewables, for geothermal, but the traditional guys are saying we can't use it. So putting infrastructure like, say, data centers at the generation source, then using excess capacity to run those models. So it's becoming quite interesting in the other models, non-traditional models, to avoid getting stuck in the IPP structure.
So, and speaking of non-traditional models, Charnelle, hydrogen is clearly very new, not only in the region, but frankly on the continent. We've been hearing whispers of, green fertilizer, green hydrogen, green steel. It'll be useful to understand what you see the role and opportunity of green hydrogen on the African continent.
Thank you, Amyn. I'd like to contest you a bit to say that hydrogen itself is not new at all. In fact, hydrogen has a whole spectrum, rainbow of colors based on the source from which it is produced. So you have, for example, blue hydrogen from oil and gas, from gas resources. Hydrogen produced from nuclear power is pink hydrogen. And it's the whole rainbow, literally. But green hydrogen is particularly called green because it is produced from renewable energy sources. Now, hydrogen in itself is forecasted to be a massive player globally going into the future to decarbonize various sectors. So I know a lot of people, when they hear green hydrogen, you immediately think green ammonia. However, hydrogen, because it's such a infinitely valuable energy carrier, it can be used to also decarbonize your transport sectors in terms of heavy and light vehicles, your rail sectors, and your maritime sectors as well, and electricity sectors too. That being said, and of course the green ammonia aspect, that being said, I will now give a bit more about what HDF Energy does. We are a hydrogen infrastructure company, but we focus primarily on decarbonizing the electricity sector. So, of course, many of you know Kenya has more than 90% renewables in its energy mix already. However, geothermal sources and hydropower sources, you really need to develop that infrastructure at the source. Now, what HDF Energy does is we have trademarked a hybrid power plant, which essentially is renewable energy plus long-term storage. Everybody knows the batteries in terms of storage, but batteries are quite limited in terms of their discharging capacity. Hydrogen has infinite capacity theoretically for that. So HDF has combined hydrogen technology, including the fuel cells, which HDF also manufactures, then to convert your stored hydrogen into electricity. So really the output of this power plant is green, stable power available 24/7. In terms of Kenya, for example, the opportunities that are here for Kenya and for East Africa, Kenya launched its green hydrogen roadmap last year at the Africa Climate Summit. And subsequent papers. But basically to say, in terms of Kenya, we've, as HDF, have taken full advantage of the support that government has given, and we have been developing for the past 2 years in Kwale County along the coastal region of Kenya, a renewable stable hydrogen to power plant, and we've been making great progress on that. We have a website. You guys are welcome to check it out for more details. It's Renew Stable Kwale, if you're interested. Now, if we look broader in terms of East Africa, what are the opportunities really? I mean, like I said, green hydrogen, you need your renewable energy. I mean, it's Africa. We have an abundance of natural resources, wind, solar, so forth. So there's all this energy just waiting to be utilized. We always like to say the sun is free, right? So it's really about valorizing these energy sources. We have access to oceans, particularly Kenya, but then some of the other East African countries, access to Great Lakes. But the big thing really in terms of the green hydrogen conversation is offtake. Offtake is key. The countries, European countries that are really spearheading green hydrogen development, the market is huge for that. I think 30 billion in the next year, a couple of years, that's forecasted. So there's really an advantage for East Africa in terms of trade routes and infrastructure like ports to export the green hydrogen molecule, and in different forms. We should definitely take advantage of that. But I will also say at the same time, as Africans, when we speak of new innovative technology, we have to also focus on domestic markets. How do we develop the technology here and make sure that it is of benefit to us in our backyards as well? And this is again where the other end uses of hydrogen, like your e-mobility. Everybody knows batteries, EVs is batteries, but you can have cars powered by hydrogen and fuel cells converting that hydrogen into electricity to have your electric vehicle. So these, and Kenya has also spearheaded EVs. So it's just about reframing sort of how we perceive things. There's not only batteries out there, batteries are great, but in terms of long-term sustainability of storage and decarbonizing various sectors, hydrogen is definitely there. We need to make sure that as Africa, we are also taking this opportunity. And then, of course, economic diversification is on the back of that. That goes hand in hand with capacity building to ensure that we don't only export the hydrogen molecule, for example, but also our talent and skills, which we have.
Dennis, notwithstanding these opportunities in the sector that we're hearing, the criticism that I often hear when we're sitting across government negotiating projects like this is that renewable energy have resulted in higher prices for the consumer. It has caused greater grid instability. It has caused greater reliance on knowing where the power is and therefore exacerbating what I would call supply-demand issues, because the supply now is not as clear as it used to be with traditional thermal projects, and the demand is unclear also. How do we address these concerns? And these concerns are with government. We know Parliament in Kenya has raised these concerns, and the citizens have raised these concerns. So how do we explain the benefits and deal with these specific issues and, frankly, criticisms about green renewable energy in East Africa?
Thank you. So when we're talking about renewable energy in East Africa, I think the main resources we're looking at is hydro, geothermal, wind, solar. There's quite an abundance of that. Then you look at a place like Kenya, we have about 3.3 gigawatts of installed capacity. Ideally, when you compare, we have done all the comparisons on where we should be. Then you speak to the industries. They don't have enough power. So everybody has a backup generator or two. But going back into history, today, our cheapest source of energy on the Kenyan grid is hydro, built in the 70s, 80s, 60s. But it's actually our cheapest source. The only problem is that we stopped building hydros. So there's no major hydro built since 1990 or something like that. So solar is now cheaper than gas. 5 years ago, gas was cheaper. So the reality, electric kind of wind is providing one of the cheapest sources of power into the Kenyan grid. So in reality, renewable energy is cheaper today than it was before. But if we stop developing renewable energy infrastructure, then we'll run into problems. We'll have to bring back fossil fuels to stabilize our grid. And that's why some people still have coal. Coal used to be the cheapest. Now it's more expensive than renewable energy. So I think one, it may be a communication issue. And the reason for that is because we are not transparent when we are sharing projects. You have seen all the noise that has been made around. I think transparency and sharing information is one, especially to the public. Second, doing it in a systematic approach, balancing, because in reality, yes, solar causes instability into the grid, but it's about planning, bringing the intermittent power of wind and solar along with baseload. But again, we have also struggled with baseload like geothermal, venting at night when no one is using it, and it's just fed into the grid. We still pay for it. So I think one of the reality is to match the demand, which is the cement companies, steel companies. We had the time of use, telling them we'll sell you power cheaper at night. But in reality, we create the framework so difficult for them to actually utilize that. So I think it's all about every stakeholder working together. Today, there are still companies in Europe who have been powering, they're still using coal, are willing to move the manufacturing here because of the demand and the requirement of the buyers. But are we ready? Maybe not yet. So we need to be able to be communicating with the end users.
And Charnelle, I guess for your specific industry, where we are now trying to address demand side of power, projects like yourselves, green ammonia, data centers that are power hungry and in a way could help to reduce some of the supply-demand imbalances. The challenges being faced by some of these projects and possibly by yourselves is you have a weak grid, frankly, that is unstable. You have significant deviations of peak demand and off-peak demand, and therefore the ability of the grid to supply you 24/7 power, whether it's for green hydrogen, whether it's for a data center or green ammonia, is very challenging across the continent. How do you overcome that challenge?
Thank you. I mean, I'm very glad you mentioned the grid instability issue. I will speak again of the project that we are developing here. A very big value add of this project is that we are able to provide essential grid supporting services through this green baseload power plant enabled by hydrogen technology. So in our case, we will actually be producing our own renewable energy on site. That's the first component of the plant. And then we have our hydrogen system and also a small battery component system. So ultimately, these three systems work together to give you stable power, but at the same time, support and strengthen your grid. And which is why we have particularly looked at the coastal region of Kenya, which is known for grid instability. That has limited a development of industry in that area in Kwale County. And bringing such a power plant that can reinforce the grid there will really be a big economic diversifier in that area.
Ifeanyi, you've clearly worked across the continent in West Africa, Anglophone, Francophone Africa. What message, if you were able to send to government in terms of best practice for developing innovative projects such as what we're just hearing about, what you've done, what Charnelle is looking to do, including the traditional IPP grid space? What are the best practices government needs to follow so that we can spur development, projects can move quicker, financing can come in a lot quicker?
Thank you. Actually, I think we need to rethink the system in general, because coming back to the things you mentioned that could be seen as challenge, as of now for me, it's immense opportunity. The grid in itself is almost a century-old technology. And we're in a time of electricity 4.0. We need to get the whole infrastructure ready for the current century that we find ourselves. And this in itself opens up the door for so many things. To be specific, and by the way, so I came here just a year ago. I was in East Asia for some time. I spent time in Vietnam before arriving in Kenya. In West Africa, you've heard one of the stories, even in Europe as well, in France. This topic is not just African issue, it's a global issue. We need to aggressively and intentionally upgrade the power distribution. Historically, it was linear. You generate with huge hydro as an example, you transmit, distribute, consume. Now, it's a two-way direction. Most likely, if you go for that, tomorrow ALN can put a solar on the roof. This in itself would distort the linear flow. So consumers are now producers, and that also means we need to rejig the way this power is generated and distributed. And that is not just something to imagine, it's something that is already possible. And it's something that can be done. And today we do have the technologies in-house that is able to enable any utility, whether it's KPLC, KENGEN, and Co, to KETRACO, to rethink and make sure that their grid is ready for today and tomorrow. And what that essentially means is that with a grid that is digital and smarter, we are able to enable different forms of renewable energy penetrate and even manage in real time the grid stability. So you are able to ensure that you can have more hydrogen to ensure stability, in real time control the power from the solar or wind, and even more interestingly, take advantage of this whole EV revolution. So with this in real time, we're able to ensure that even as you drive, you can be able to charge your car when it's time to maintain stability and take power from the car with very intelligent, smart charging infrastructure. So these things are not something that we can imagine. These are things that are already practical. So the last example with in Vietnam, it was exactly the same story. They had so much renewable. They came to us because they wanted to see how to enable this distributed energy resource management system that they had to work on to inject a lot of this into their network. Now we are in a changing moment in Kenya where you have so much hydro, geothermal, wind, solar coming on board, and soon hydrogen. It also brings an immense opportunity for us to rethink the grid distribution network at all levels. Distribution network with KPLC, KETRACO, but even the private networks. Because these cars that we are going to be releasing on the roads, we've seen some of the buses already on EV, they would need to be maintained, and we need to create that platform for more of it to come online. So we don't need to think far. We can do it already. We have trained engineers here in Kenya, across East Africa, strong partners that we are constantly working with, upskilling, available to walk through the business model, but more importantly, the use case to make it work. And maybe just in one last point, and this is to buttress what she was sharing about local content. So this has to happen across. It's not just at the big utility, but even down to the electricians that design our homes as well. We need to design a home that is ready for the future, and it doesn't have to break the bank to do it. For us at Schneider, what we have been doing is intentionally address this grassroots skill development. A few months ago, training center was opened here in Nairobi, where we've equipped those labs with state-of-the-art equipment to train new generation electricians to be able to do just that. Make sure that these facilities are very efficient. Across our business in East Africa, we are now onboarding strong partners, whom we are upskilling. Some of them are in this room, by the way. Go to their facilities, state-of-the-art, strong assembly lines, and the intent is to keep sharing the skills so that together we can keep addressing many of these things that we see as challenge, because these are rooms to make real difference and real impact across. So to your last question, what is the advice for the government? Let's have an open-minded approach towards addressing these issues. Let's keep learning best practice, but more importantly, ensuring that we have more local capacity in country. We need to create more rooms to make sure that this skill transfer can be deployed. And let's be more open to even pilot projects. We need to develop solutions for Kenya, address and enable Kenyans to be able to innovate with the skills that they learn, to pilot these initiatives and learn from it. We can only fail fast and learn from it to move forward. So this will be my...
On that very positive note, although I have 0 seconds, I don't know if I'm allowed to, maybe we'll have 2 questions only, because I think we're going to be kicked out pretty quickly. Any questions out there for our great panel? Or is everybody ready for lunch? Clearly everybody is ready for lunch. Look, on that positive note, firstly, I want to thank this fabulous panel for that really interesting discussion. I want to thank all of you for joining us on this discussion. Yes, and hopefully we can continue to make progress on what is a groundbreaking sector. We have seen incredible innovation in the renewable energy space over the last 20 years. But clearly that innovation is developing at a scale that is pretty remarkable right now. So we hope all the stakeholders will join together and continue with this progress. Thank you very much.